Corey, get up. We gotta go.
Welcome back to Rings and Realms. I'm Corey Olson, the Tolkien professor.
And I'm Maggie Park. I focus on film, fans, and adaptations.
We are so excited to be back at Studio Lab in Derry, New Hampshire with our incredible team. And it's thanks to our Kickstarter supporters that we're able to do all of the amazing things that you're going to see this season.
Our initial campaign on Kickstarter was successful, thank you, but we are able to accept pledges throughout the entire season. So please do consider pledging your support to Rings and Realms on Kickstarter.
If this is your first time with us, welcome. This show is here to help explore and explain some of the core themes of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and how it's connected with Tolkien's Middle-earth. As ever, we're here to provide insight and analysis, not reactions. This is a safe space to consider the adaptation choices in Prime Video's Rings of Power.
So we have a lot to cover, so let's get started.
We begin episode 1 in flashback. A young and frankly naive-looking Sauron recapitulates his bright new vision for Middle-earth's future. He speaks like he spoke before of healing the world, bringing it order and creating a world in which he and his servants will be celebrated as heroes. Notice his subtle awareness of the story that will one day be told. Sauron wants to rewrite his story. That in itself is echoed in the choice to start the episode in flashback. We are being asked to view Sauron's story again from a different angle. Sauron's vision is a really interesting adaptation because it fills in a gap in Tolkien's story. Tolkien never explains why Sauron does what he does. Sauron in the book is just the Dark Lord. He plays a totally different role in the story. Book Sauron doesn't have a motto or a recruiting slogan. He's just seeking to dominate the world. At the end of season 1, we heard Sauron's own narrative about his own domination. That only he can bring healing and order, and that he must have control in order to achieve those things. Season 2 begins with a reminder and restatement of this concept, so we should keep in mind that Sauron's vision is given as a framework for everything that follows in this season. Another major emphasis in the opening sequence is the betrayal of Sauron by Adar. The final scene between Adar and Sauron when he's imprisoned as Halbrand introduces a new element. Adar reminisces about how he first became joined to Sauron. He remembers the torment that twisted him from elf to Uruk. He speaks with something near fondness of Sauron bringing him the wine like blood and his choice to drink it all. In that moment of drinking wine on the mountaintop, that moment which is both very personal but also very ritualistic, Adar remembers binding himself to Sauron. Adar said, remember, in season 1 that only blood can bind, but apparently blood wine does the job too. By the way, when you notice blood or dark viscous liquid dripping in these early episodes, remember Adar's line, only blood can bind. Anyway, the relationship between Sauron and Adar was real, a good reason why they both hate each other so very much now. It isn't just one bad guy stabbing another bad guy in the back. It was a deeply personal betrayal. Now, take a step back and notice the larger pattern here and what we're learning about Sauron's character. Sauron had a number two, a lieutenant, with whom he worked for thousands of years. Adar betrayed him, and what do we see Sauron do in Season 1? Try to recruit a new number two in Galadriel, a queen and partner who can rule at his side. That didn't work either, but the books suggest that he will soon have a new number two, the Witch King. This, apparently, is how Sauron rolls. We should remember, of course, that Sauron himself was Morgoth's number two. The pattern we see in his own planning does not just reflect his personality. This is what he knows. He wants to step into Morgoth's shoes. He seems to need somebody to step into his old shoes. But remember his description of that relationship, his relationship with Morgoth, like an iron hand clasping his throat. He felt himself to be absolutely enslaved to Morgoth's will. By seeking to enslave others and dominate their wills, Sauron is perpetuating the cycle of abuse and enslavement. Notice something, however. We jump from Forodwaith all the way to the Southlands. Sauron has been walking for a long time. He's acquired clothes and a sword. He's covered most of Middle-earth. A completely unknown amount of time has passed, and we definitely don't know what might have happened along the way. In my opinion, the visual connection between Spaghetti Monster Sauron and the black veins of corruption in the Tree of Linden establish a pretty strong link. I think it's extremely likely that he had something to do with the poisoning of the tree in Linden, and he certainly had time to stop by there on his way between Forodwaith and the Southlands. Regardless, let's focus on the scene that we do get, the meeting with the Southlanders and his decision to get on the boat. It's set up to look like a change of mind for Sauron, a change of direction. He's on his way towards death, towards Mordor. He turns aside, turns west instead. Is he genuinely changing course? There's book precedent for this possibility. Tolkien says that at the beginning of the Second Age, Sauron actually, for a time, repented of his evil deeds. Is that what we're getting? Is this the dramatization of repenting Sauron?
Okay, I want to take a minute to talk about a unique moment in Sauron's journey here. Right before he enters the Southlands, we have some pretty interesting visual cues leading up to this moment. We start with this scene where it's just him at a close-up shot. He's on the left looking ahead with this red filter over the entire shot. Everything else in that shot is dark except for his stare, which is quite lit up. His face then fades as the camera rises very slowly, and there's this really soft light. We can assume it's like dawn or late afternoon, but it's really warm, it's very inviting. And in this scene, he is walking directly at us. We're watching him come closer to us. That's pretty important. We see the path and his forward progression. We then, as the camera, turn around the back of him and we see the destruction that's rising above the trees and see that he is actually walking into that destruction. But he's really leisurely. He's very relaxed. Then we hear the line, "That way lies death." And he says, "That is my path." Perhaps the fortunate ones were the first to die. We're not entirely sure what he means there. Like they were lucky that they are avoiding this massacre that's about to come. Perhaps by his own hand, right? We don't know if that means good or bad. And in that moment, when he says the fortunate ones were the first to die, he actually turns his entire body around on the word fortunate. Is it him being curious? Is it him being a bit incredulous? We're not entirely sure there. The light that is coming in this scene from the old man as he turns, the light behind the old man is really backlighting this old man. It's making him seem quite wise, a little bit holy, perhaps using him as a bit of a beacon, which suggests that there's another life waiting for him outside of this path. You just have to turn towards it. And then he actually turns towards it. So there is this line, you just have to turn towards that other option, and he physically turns towards it. His feet don't really move there. There's no forward or backwards progression, but there is a shifting of point and person. And then he starts to ask about the heraldry. So there's this line in there about, it could be a grim reminder or a hopeful one. So we constantly have these opposites shown to us. And this can kind of subconsciously affect whether we believe this moment or not. Are we looking at death, fear, and destruction from Sauron? Or could we, as the audience, possibly consider that he is also considering change and hope and maybe choosing good? Then there's this line that sometimes it can lead to someplace better, someplace good. There's a literal path in front of Sauron right now that is warm, welcoming. It's downhill. It has a community. It's safe. And it's completely opposite to his original path. And we start to wonder, which one is he going to choose? It starts to feel like he's going to join these guys and he's going to change his ways. Come join us if you like, or walk on if you like, and keep chasing death, is the line from the old man. And at this point, the light on Sauron, he's half lit, but the light is coming from the old man. So is he curious about this redemption? Is that light actually shining on him, making him turn towards that and say, ooh, I'm toying with this idea of being good? Is he curious about these lands that he's speaking about? Then he says, the choice is yours, friends. And he pauses. He looks at the path. This is Sauron. He looks at the path. We think he's going to walk back, right? We think he's going to repent. But does he? No. Stick with that scene. There is no movement from him. Yes, he actually does go and join these folks. We learn that in the next scene. But there's no physical visual cue to show us that he has changed his ways there. Plus, we also hear a few notes from the theme of Sauron in the background in the music here. So it just kind of hits like, ooh, are we supposed to believe that he's going to make this change and go this direction? But there is no forward momentum. So there's no visual cue showing us that he repents. It doesn't set us up for anything other than this is part of his evil plan.
So, do we think Sauron's conversion is legit? Let's think about a few elements in that scene. Consider the destination of the men in the boat. They say they're sailing into the west. There's no hint of a specific reference to Númenor. They don't say they're sailing to an island or anything like that. Instead, their journey sounds like a very light in the west kind of journey. What I mean by that is in the Silmarillion, we know that tribes of humans are kind of migrating west over the continent because there have been stories, there have been myths and rumors that there is a land in the west, that the land of the gods is out in the west, and they're journeying to try to find it. They don't even know at that point that it's across the sea. And it seems to be very much this same kind of journey that these people are on. They have heard rumors and myths about maybe Númenor, maybe Valinor, maybe both, right? And they have formed from this, apparently, this quite vague concept of a paradise beyond the sea that'll bring them peace and happiness and where the streets are paved with gold, right? That seems to be the frame of mind of those people. And Sauron is joining them, right? Sauron, this is where Sauron is going. Now, it's true that we are confronted, as Maggie was showing, the old man that Sauron meets presents a very clear choice. This is his choice between life and death, between hope and despair. So maybe despite the visual cues that Maggie was pointing to, you are thinking that maybe he does repent, or you want to believe that he does repent. But you have to admit that even if he does, it's very brief, right? We see him turn away from that. If he does make a happy choice, he turns away from it on the boat because he chooses death for the kindly old man who tried to help him. And I think actually that points to a fundamental irony that perhaps you might not process the first time you hear that initial conversation between him and the old man, right? The old man they're talking about the path of death. He's on the path of death, headed towards Mordor in the Southlands, right? The irony is that the old man is speaking of it as if it's his own death, as if by going down the path of death, he is going down the path of self-destruction. But of course, Sauron is not going down the path of self-destruction, or doesn't think he is, right? He is thinking not of his own death, but of the death of others. Now, of course, you could say there's a further irony to say that the path that he is on is indeed the path down to the void, the path of destruction that all evil people are going down, right? Yes, but again, he's cheerfully, he accepts that path, right? So, how do we understand this, right? It's hard for me to believe that if he did repent, he would repent this way. What does he think he's doing? What does he think he's accomplishing by getting on the boat? Does he believe they're sailing to Valinor? I can't imagine he would get onto the boat with that expectation or that hope. Besides which, even if for some reason Sauron would want to go to Valinor, and I'm not sure why even a repentant Sauron would be real excited to head straight back to Valinor, But even if he did, he's got to realize this is not Vingalot he's getting into, right? The odds of this ship getting to Valinor are 0, right? So why? Why is he doing it? But here's the hard part. It's also difficult to believe that he has a plan, that this is all a shrewd scheme on his part. Some people might say that, well, maybe his plan was to get to Numenor in order to corrupt them, right? As we know he's gonna do later on. But the episode does not give us a hint of a reference to Numenor to prompt us to think along those directions. We don't get any help in that direction. So if you watched Rings and Realms Season 1, I know you're wondering, am I satisfied with his reason for getting on the boat? It was a big question I ended Season 1 with, and I have to say, not really. I definitely do not buy his repentance. I don't think he genuinely repented even for a minute. But I also don't think that there is clear evidence that shows that he has a clever scheme in mind for getting on the boat instead. I definitely, I will say, do not believe that he's planning to meet Galadriel. Some have tried to argue that he knows he's going to meet her swimming in the middle of the ocean, and that's why he goes out onto the boat and onto the raft. I think his own words make it clear that that is not true. His first words to her, remember, he talks about the tides of fate. He clearly sees his meeting with her as a chance meeting, an unexpected meeting, a stroke of destiny that looks like chance. He speaks to her about her choice, right? Her tide is going to flow in or it's going to flow out, depending on whether or not she embraces the opportunity that fate has brought to her in their meeting, right? But his choice of what he's going to do and what he hopes for from her is made in that instant as he embraces his fate. But unfortunately, none of this really helps me to understand why Sauron would get on that boat in the first place.
We wanted to take a second here and talk about the journey that Galadriel and Sauron are on at this moment, because it's almost identical, right? When you look at Galadriel and Sauron on their boats, possibly even just a few hours apart from each other, it seems like a remarkably parallel situation. But all of the visual cues that we get on the screen are completely inverted. They are the absolute opposites. So with Sauron, it's dark. It is nighttime. We have a square, rigid boat, and it is sailing into the darkness. Whereas with Galadriel, it's daytime, it's bright, it's warm. Her boat is very round and fluid, and it's sailing directly into the light. Now, when Galadriel goes from above the water into the water, and then Sauron from the water into the air, we also have this opposite movement. So Sauron is down in the depths. He is in this dark space. It is blue, dark, mysterious, nothing else around him. The only source of light is coming from up above, and we don't know what's going on in these mysterious depths and dark unknown. But he's not panicked. He calmly swims upwards. We have this kind of Christ-like imagery almost of him rising towards the surface. Whereas with Galadriel, we have the opposite of that. We have this ball of bright light behind her. It's very warm and it's inviting, and it should be what she's reaching towards. But instead, she leaves it and she dives down into the depths of the water. She leaves the warm, bright light above her, and we see her swan diving downward. And then when they come from the water onto the raft, we also see this inversion. So Sauron sputters up. He's out of breath, sure, but he's still quite controlled and very powerful in the movement from when he surfaces of the water until he gets himself onto the raft. He reaches himself onto the raft, he grabs out with his left hand, and he crawls on. Whereas Galadriel, she has been swimming forever, so she is exhausted, she's drained. She needs help onto that raft, and she's pulled up by her right hand. So we do have these complete opposites in their resurfacing and joining the raft. And don't forget that we've actually already seen an actual moment of mirroring. The vision at the end of season 1 in episode 8 of them on the raft, the camera spins full circle to their reflection in the water. Sauron sees them working together. He sees a vision of greatness to come of them working together, whereas she is horrified by the reflection of the evil that she sees. So in that same vision, we have opposite reactions. So just keeping that in mind as we go forward, because we feel this is a pretty intense visual cue that we're being shown, this opposites element of Sauron and Galadriel.
Galadriel and Sauron both end up separated from their ships and in the sea. They seem like very similar situations, but once again, the whole circumstances mirror each other. Galadriel willingly dives off her perfectly sound ship. She leaves them to go on to life and to her home, sacrificing her own return. Sauron has his ship destroyed and ripped away from him, and along the way, he abandons his companion to death. Once again, these two things are parallel but opposite to each other. Sauron's relationship with Galadriel is complicated. We talked about how his desire to bring her around shows us something about him, but we can see what these mirroring patterns show us about Galadriel too. Gil-galad speaks of how Sauron has already compromised Galadriel. Elrond expresses his doubts. He inverts the famous whispered words of Finrod from season 1. Instead of moving confidently to the light because she has touched the darkness, Elrond suggests that she has turned away from the light because she was drawn to the darkness all along. But as Maggie has shown, the careful parallels between Sauron and Galadriel that episode 1 creates show fairly clearly that Elrond is wrong. Galadriel was proud, and she was deceived, and by trying to exploit Halbrand, she was herself exploited. But although her path is strikingly similar to Sauron's, as we saw, they're not the same. Galadriel's path may have gone very crooked, but her goal is indeed opposite to Sauron's goal. The focal point of the elf story in episode 1 is the danger of the Rings of Power. When it comes to the three rings, this is a really fascinating question. The book is genuinely ambivalent on this. On the one hand, the three are depicted as unstained. We're invited to think that they are purely good and opposed to the evil and corruption of the other rings. On the other hand, the elven rings are designed to preserve all things, which sounds good until you realize that that's working against Ilúvatar's design for Middle-earth. There is something like rebellion intrinsic to the operation of the three rings in the book. The show picks right up on this ambiguity in the text. Elrond fears that the three are corrupted by Sauron, and that they will provide a mechanism through which he can consolidate power. Galadriel asserts that Sauron never touched them, and that they are untainted. They're both not wrong. Galadriel is right. The three were not touched. They were not directly corrupted. But Elrond's impulse that Sauron plans to use the rings to establish his power over Middle-earth is dead on. Elrond is also right that the three will be, in Sauron's intention at least, the mechanism through which he hopes to gain control of the elves, through the domination of the One Ring later on. The three rings will in fact lay the elves open to Sauron's domination. Several times in this episode, we see elves struggling with temptations to power. The elements of that struggle should look very familiar to Tolkien fans. The desire for the rings, to use them for really good reasons, of course, drive Galadriel and Gil-galad to turn against their friend. Elrond, in his desire to keep the rings away from others, separates himself from his friends for their own good, like Frodo does again and again in The Lord of the Rings. Círdan, who takes on himself the burden of the rings just in order to convey them to a crack in the earth where they might be disposed of, ends up claiming ownership of the rings himself, and the next time we see him, he is wearing one of the rings of power on his own finger. I'm not saying that the three rings have the same kind of corruptive influence that the One Ring has in The Lord of the Rings. I'm only saying that the temptation and desire for the rings create some haunting and even disturbingly familiar situations in this episode. Some are more ambiguous and uncertain, though. When Nenya bounces down the stairs and lands at Galadriel's feet, I was reminded, of course, of the ring bouncing away from Gollum and coming to Bilbo in the film. But I also couldn't help but remember Bilbo, after his party at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, justifying his own obsession with the ring by saying, "It is mine, it came to me." In the end, I think the point here isn't that the three rings are corrosive and evil. It seems to me that the primary point is simply that the desire for power, even power to do good, is very dangerous. The problem with the three rings isn't primarily their magic. It's the power that they provide. Now, we are introduced here in episode 1 to Círdan, and I am in love with this character. Ben Daniels is amazing as Círdan. There are two small observations that I would make about Círdan. First, notice how they set up Círdan's complicated relationship to Valinor in this episode. We know that Círdan is one of the very oldest elves alive. He is the shipwright, for he has dedicated himself to making ships that will bear other elves on a one-way trip back to Valinor, while he himself patiently waits century after patient century on the shores of the sea. He is the one who enables others to return to paradise, but he himself has never even been there. Notice how they tell this story elegantly through two images. In the first, we see Círdan standing looking out over the sea to the west, staring towards Valinor. The longing is palpable. In the second, we see a gorgeous sunset in the west, and Círdan is in the foreground, darkly silhouetted against the sky. There is light and beauty in the west, but he sits in the land of shadows, his face turned away from the west, waiting patiently. Círdan is one of the greatest elven craftsmen, and I couldn't help but remember Celebrimbor's slogan, "True creation requires sacrifice." Second observation, did you catch the Narya moment at the end of the episode? Narya is the red ring, the ring of fire, and it's the ring that Círdan claims. In the book, Círdan says that this ring can be used to rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill. It's a ring associated with the renewal of hope and courage. When we see Círdan wearing Narya, what is he doing? Striding into the convocation of despairing elves, bringing light and hope and warmth. Here is your introduction to the Ring of Fire. I expect we're going to see it at work again. Okay, we need to talk about the fading of the elves. In Season 1, I was a bit confused by the references to the fading of the elves, and in particular, to the urgency about the elves fading away within the year. Now, when I'm watching an adaptation, I try to keep an open mind, not just about liking things, but about understanding things. The makers of adaptations can and do change things for reasons relating to the story that they're telling, and that's fine. But of course, when it comes to the basic rules of how the world works, I tend to start with the assumption that the world works the same as it does in the book, until the show or film gives me enough reason to understand that they're definitely changing the rules. The problem I had was that the description of the fading seemed about 90% identical to the expectations I brought with me from Tolkien's books. Gil-galad and Celebrimbor and Elrond were talking about how the elves were going to fade, how their spirits would consume their bodies, and how they would diminish into powerless shadows of their current selves if they did not depart from Middle-earth. Check, check, and check. That's exactly the situation as Tolkien describes it after the Years of the Sun begin, during that time which Sam Gamgee in the Fellowship of the Ring calls the fading time. The only difference between what we saw in the show and what is described in the book is the strange panic that they were all in. The idea that the fading was going to start right now and was going to finish in the next few months. Last season, I doubted the truth of this. It sounded like it fit the pattern of a classic Sauronic deception. Tell someone something that is mostly true, but contains one false element that will play on their fears and put them under your control. I thought, therefore, that the accelerated fading was the lie that was being told in order to raise their fears so that Sauron as Anatar could offer them a way of mastering that fear. I no longer believe that. From last season, plus episode 1 of this season, I now believe that the show is really asking me to believe that the rapid fading is happening. I still don't fully understand the causes there. I suspect there's more that we don't understand. But the core story of the elf plot in episode 1 is that the rapid fading is almost upon them, and that the power of the three rings held it off. And here's the interesting thing that I noticed. What happens to the elves at the beginning of the Fourth Age, at the end of The Lord of the Rings, after the War of the Ring? The time of the elves is ended, and the dominion of men has come. All of the elves must leave the world or diminished, as described in the show. And what also happens at the beginning of the Fourth Age? The bearers of the three rings leave Middle-earth and their power is removed. So, as soon as the three stop being wielded in Middle-earth, the fading increases. The time of the elves is over and the dominion of men begins. To my surprise, in some ways, it actually kind of tracks, not quite so urgently as is described in the show, but it's similar in any case. Now, I still have lots of questions about causality here, but we can come back to that later. after perhaps we learn a little bit more. For now, I'm going to continue to work on making peace with the accelerated fading of the elves.
I just want to point out a few moments of visual storytelling that we have going on at the tree in Linden. When you're watching this scene, just keep these things in mind. I particularly want to focus on the levels and the camera angles that we see in this scene and the shots that make up the story and what that tells us about what's going on. So first we start with Gil-galad and Círdan up on the higher level in front of that crowd. They're a few steps above everybody else, and every time the camera's on them, there's this slight up angle on Gil-galad, and then there's a slight downward angle on Galadriel, and a straight shot on Elrond. So this positions them in these spaces of power. We have Gil-galad up high, making him look powerful, Galadriel down low, less powerful, Elrond straight on, neutral. Then when the rings are presented, one of the rings immediately is dropped and falls down these steps. So there's this actual changing of levels from high to low. Galadriel picks it up and we immediately switch. No longer do we have this downward angle onto Galadriel. We have an upward tilted camera looking up as she rises to the same level in the camera's eye as the other two. We then get a straight shot on Gil-galad, so then it's marking them more as equal, and he puts on his ring amongst the rest of his bling. And then we get a straight shot on Galadriel, so they are now equal, on the same space. Once she puts on her ring, we get the warmth immediately returning. There's sunshine, there's golden tones, and with the will of the elves made real through the rings, the tree heals itself. We see the buds first, then those golden veins erupting on the tree, followed by the leaves, the light, the glowing, the warmth, and there's this heavenly music that's reminiscent of Galadriel's theme. And then we get this shot where she climbs the steps, she's on the same level as them, they put their hands into the center of the shot, and we get that triangle. It's the same triangle we see in the beginning of Peter Jackson's trilogy as well. The trilogy of the three of them is just this sign of strength. So having that held, they love this shot, having that held and then spinning upward as the camera goes up, we get this real feeling of decision made, level absolutely established. We know what's happening here. These guys are on the same team. And then our next shot is a forge firing up, and they're going to get more. So they're a little obsessed with that. So just things to keep in mind as we go ahead. I think it's these visual cues that help us tell the story, and good for us to keep in mind as we take in the other things that they're going to show us.
The Rhûn story begins with our friendly neighborhood blue wizard and his spunky Harfoot sidekick, hopelessly lost in the barren lands of the East. The first step to finding your path, it turns out, is admitting that you are lost, an important life lesson for us all. As we watch Nori and the stranger getting lost and going around in circles, we should, of course, be remembering Frodo and Sam, who got similarly lost in terrain not far away as they set out on the first stage of their journey on their own, at the start of Book 4 in The Lord of the Rings. Now, this focus on their need to find their way makes explicit a theme we've seen played out across all of the storylines in this episode, actually. Sauron has a plan, and he thinks he sees a clear path down which he will march triumphantly to the achievement of his glorious purpose. Sauron's plan goes sharply sideways, however, and ends up taking many unexpected turns. His story may at times look like a story of getting lost and finding oneself, but as I explained before, I don't think that's really it. Sauron's story is instead the story of a cunning and resourceful improv artist who is always ready to make the most out of whatever unexpected elements he encounters on his way. The Elves of Linden are definitely struggling to find their path. As Galadriel gallops wildly in the wrong direction, Gil-galad pivots suddenly to stand with Galadriel against Elrond, Círdan unexpectedly turns his boat right around, and Elrond just throws himself off a cliff. In the Rhûn plot, the theme of seeking the right path forward is at its most explicit and most literal. Nori and the stranger do not just need to find the route into Rhûn, but they need to figure out what their quest is. What are they supposed to accomplish? Guidance comes in the form of Poppy, who realizes that her lovely and very catchy walking song from season 1 in fact gives clues to the path they must take. Last season, we heard the song while watching a montage of the Brandyfoot family migration. While Poppy sang, the trail of their wanderings literally appeared on the screen on the map. Notice the irony here. The walking song turns out to be not just a way to make the family's regular journey go along more pleasantly. It's actually a guide into lands unknown to Nori and Poppy. Now that they have gone off and left the family behind, they have discovered a new purpose, a new significance even to their own family traditions. It turns out they are not going off trail at all. They are not breaking from, but fulfilling the Harfoot destiny. Now, notice one other thing about this. They are moving forward into the unknown, but they are also moving back in time, back to their roots. The old maps and the old song both seem to suggest that the Harfoots came from Rhûn in a time now forgotten by living Harfoots. What will they find as they walk backwards into the past of their people? Now, this seems very fitting, for in Tolkien, the Far East is always associated with roots and beginnings. Humans had their origins in the East in the past, and the human cultures of the Far East are the inheritors of the cultural traditions of their ancient ancestors. And, spoilers, their ancient ancestors made some very bad decisions. Even the Elves first awakened in the Far East. As they move further east, we can expect the companions to discover more of the unknown past of the Harfoots, and of the unknown future of the stranger. The other important emphasis in this episode is on the power of the stranger. My favorite element here was the way in which the magic of the stranger shaking the sand and pebbles of the desert floor recalled the patterns of the resonating sand in the introductory sequence of the show. Last season, I explained that the vibrations of sound bringing order and shape to chaos that we see in the intro sequence recalls the music of the Ainur, the creation of the world through music that we read about in the opening pages of the Silmarillion. The similarity of the stranger's magic to that visual effect seems very important to me, an implication that his power operates by tapping into or resonating with that fundamental music of creation. Also, notice that as the stranger is attempting to rouse the tree, he says the word cuivie, which means awakening. He appears to be trying to awaken the sleeping or dying land around him. The trees are dead, and they do not respond even to his appeal. In Tolkien's world, evil power is often surrounded by desolation, an area of land touched by that evil and made infertile and dead. The stranger appears to be trying to work against that power, to bring life back to the desolation. The stranger fails, bringing only further destruction to the land by blasting the already dead tree. The tree doesn't bring forth fruit, and instead only infestation. The swarm of horrible cockroaches that spill up out of the tree trunk seem at first like a mockery of the fruit that they had hoped to find. But Nori turns failure into victory. She sees not a horrible infestation, but a bountiful feast. Her friend has saved the day again. It is a delightfully unexpected reversal. The most intriguing question about our friend the Blue Wizard is his wizard staff. This is a complicated question in Tolkien's works, and the answer really is not clear. What is the nature of a wizard's staff? Does it contain magic? Does it grant power? If a wizard loses his staff, is his power reduced? The stranger's desire to control his power and his vision of his wizard's staff gives us a clue to how this whole staff business is going to work in the Rings of Power. It's clear in any case that they're planning to invest in this issue a good deal more. One final note on the Rhûn spy, the observer. The final sequence here has a very marked effect. We see Nori and the stranger through the spy's eyes, and the view is distorted bizarrely, looking almost like the faceted sight of an insect. It gives the impression of something monstrous, something inhuman. Then we turn and see the spy himself, and he's looking through a cracked spyglass. He's not inhuman at all. But then he pulls down the spyglass and gah! We see nothing but a hideous metallic death mask with empty black sockets. He's dehumanized even more. Once again, we're given a sense of a ravaged creation. It's as if we're seeing a person twisted like the dry, dead lands around him. Whatever the other Blue Wizard is up to, it is not good. My favorite moment of episode 1 was the stranger's speech about his memories. He says he misses his home, even though he doesn't remember it. There's a connection that goes beyond conscious thought. indistinctly touching only his dreams and his feelings. He speaks of glimpses and a longing that he can't explain. This idea touches on a very important theme in Tolkien's work. Many of his characters have a sense of home and a longing that they can't resist forever. Elves long for the sea, Faramir often dreams of Númenor, and Sam wonders what's going on back home. This isn't just about loving something and missing it when you're gone. The stranger neither loves nor remembers his home. The longing is deeper than that, and the glimpse is more powerful as a result. This phenomenon is derived from a deeper sense of belonging, of true home. Elves long for the sea because elven home lies across the sea. Faramir dreams of Númenor because it's in his blood. It is the true home of his people, the true home to which they can never return. Sam himself senses that hobbits, in some deep way, belong in the Shire. This theme of longing and belonging comes up quietly in several important ways in Episode 1. Nori and Poppy miss their family and their home, but there's more than that. Through the walking song and their new understanding of it, the Harfoots get glimpses from their ancestral past, glimpses that they don't yet understand at all. The struggle is real for the elves, who are caught in an interesting conflict. They don't want to fade and go into the West. It would be irresponsible to fade. The people of Middle-earth need them. And yet, Galadriel remembers the light of Valinor shining on her face, and Círdan stands gazing out over the horizon, staring into the West that he has not experienced, but for which he also longs. Adar has a vision very different from Sauron's. Young Sauron speaks of the orcs being worshipped as heroes, but he's clearly thinking only of his own glory. Adar wanted to establish a home for his children, for they've never had a place where they truly belonged. Interestingly, Adar and the orcs are the only people in the whole show who've discovered a newfound belonging, who are trying not to recover something or to return to something, but to keep that which they have found. I don't know to what extent this is going to grow into a larger theme in this season, but its emergence in Episode 1 was a delightful surprise. The nature and status of orcs is one of the most complicated issues in all of Tolkien, and the Rings of Power continues to embody this issue in some really complicated and interesting ways. In Sauron's speech at the beginning of Episode 1, he calls the orcs a corrupted and ignoble race, worthy only to be hunted and slaughtered. Now, this exactly illustrates what we actually see through most of the published Lord of the Rings. Remember Legolas and Gimli bragging at the Battle of Helm's Deep about how many orcs they had hunted and slaughtered. It was a game to them, right? Tolkien had his own transformation over the course of writing. I believe this happened while writing The Lord of the Rings. Orcs originally for Tolkien were the perfect antagonists. They were automatons run by the Dark Lord. They were murder bots, which by killing them you decommissioned. There was no moral implication to killing orcs. And he starts writing The Lord of the Rings this way. And we can see that attitude, the original attitude towards orcs, reflected in many of the characters in The Lord of the Rings. But of course, as the story of The Lord of the Rings went on, Tolkien began to kind of problematize this a little bit. He began to realize that wasn't going to work. He had some philosophical problems with this and began to work out what that would mean, how that would work. And the problem is, he never came to a satisfying conclusion about what the origins of orcs were, and therefore what the current nature of orcs are. He had many, many theories. One of those theories was that the orcs are corrupted elves, and his son Christopher Tolkien chose that particular story to publish in the Silmarillion. That's, of course, the origin story of the orcs that most people are familiar with. Now, the Rings of Power comes along and not only illustrates that old attitude towards orcs, we saw it in Galadriel in Season 1, we hear Sauron speaking of it, and we see it to be true with most of the good guys during the course of the story, right? But of course, the Rings of Power is also leaning into the full significance of Christopher's choice to say the official, because it's official now that it's in the published Silmarillion, the official explanation of orcs is that they're corrupted elves. Adar's whole backstory reflects that. His attitude towards the orcs as his children, the kind of humanization of the orcs that we do see happening in the Rings of Power, especially over the course of episodes 1 through 3, These are complexities that are in fact the results. The interesting thing, of course, is that some of these implications are exactly why Tolkien didn't like this theory. He was not sold on the corrupt elves theory, but Christopher had to choose one to put in the published Silmarillion. We still get these callbacks, like in Sauron's speech, to these older views. And the Rings of Power, therefore, is inviting us to share in Tolkien's own growing sense of these problems as we see both of these attitudes towards orcs competing over the course of the show. Okay, we need to talk about Sauron's body. I know the black goo and the spaghetti monster, it's a lot, right? There's so much that we could discuss about the relationship between the body and the spirit among the Maiar, the beings like Sauron. It's really complicated. It would take, as Sam says in The Return of the King, a week's answer or none at all. I did want to say this, though. There is a model that I think we should keep in mind when we're thinking about what's going on during these early stages of Sauron's rebuilding of his physical form. First, let's think about the visual cues that we receive from the show. Why does Sauron look like a spaghetti monster in the first place? Why are we seeing these black threads of darkness and corruption making up his form? Well, let's ask, where do we see threads that look just like these? Of course, the answer is in the diseased tree in Lindon, when we see those black threads working their way up the trunks and infecting the leaves. This implies, of course, that Sauron is involved. This connects Sauron visually with the corruption of the tree in Lindon. Now, but where do we first see black threads like that? In the two trees in Valinor, when we get the darkening of the trees way back in the prologue section of episode 1 of season 1, we see the trees of Valinor being corrupted, and we see those black threads of evil creeping up the trunk and darkening the trees. This is associated with Morgoth, whose enormous shadow we see looming over the trees there in the sky. Morgoth, Sauron's master. So you see what they've given us here. We see Morgoth with the big corruption of the huge trees in the first age, and Sauron associated apparently with the lesser corruption of the lesser but parallel tree in the second age. By the way, this kind of pattern is exactly how things work in Tolkien time and time again, where we see a thing happen in big picture mythical terms in the first age, and then almost exactly the same thing happen again in a later age in a smaller scale. Now, but let's get back to the black threads of corruption, overcoming the light by darkness. This seems to be close to Sauron's essence, given that we see him that way in this early form, right? We see him starting off as a squirming, sickening, writhing mass of corrupting threads of darkness. Now, here's the second thing I think that we should remember. We should be thinking about another character from the Silmarillion that the show doesn't talk about, but who's sort of lurking in the background, I think. And that's the character of Ungoliant. Ungoliant is darkness embodied. She's like the demigod of darkness itself. And she takes the form of a giant spider. She is the queen and mother of all giant spiders in all of Tolkien's world. And she is darkness which hungers for light and life, which devours that light and strengthens herself with the power of the things that she consumes. The more powerful the thing that she eats, the greater she becomes. In the Silmarillion, it is Ungoliant who attacks the two trees, setting her mouth to their trunks and sucking the light and life out of them. She's not mentioned in the show, but the creeping darkness going up the trunks of the trees and the desiccation, the drawing out of their light, recalls her presence. Now, what does Sauron do as he's trying to increase in strength? He consumes the life of living creatures, and the larger they are, the greater he grows. He kills and devours the rat and the centipede and grows a little bit larger. He kills and devours the woman in the wagon, and that gives him the power to be able to take on human form. He's clearly not possessing her human form. It's not her, right? He's not just eating her and from that, learning how to make a human form. It seems that, like Ungoliant, Sauron is the shadow taking form, the darkness strengthening itself with the lives of others. Okay, so at the end of episode 1, Sauron swears a vow to Adar, and we all hear him fudge it, swearing the vow to the Lord of Mordor instead of to Adar by name. And there is, of course, a moment in The Lord of the Rings that we should be remembering here, when Frodo captures Gollum, and Gollum swears a vow to Frodo to obey him. He swears to serve the Master of the Precious, rather than serving Frodo by name. And that parallel is a really interesting one. What makes it particularly interesting is that Gollum's own vow is one of the things that leads to his own destruction. He is trapped in his own vow, and it ends up helping to bring about his destruction, but also the ultimate good, the destruction of the ring itself. Is this vow that Sauron is taking to Adar, is this going to entrap him? Is this going to be in some way instrumental, or at least foreshadowing the bringing about of ultimate good? It'll be really interesting to see if we can see any further connections there. Okay, another thing that jumped out at me in this episode was the reference to the Ettenmoors. Gil-galad speaks of throwing Galadriel in fetters and casting her to the Ettenmoors. Now, two things. First, we can see in this a foreshadowing of the introduction of the gigantic troll Damrod. The word Etten means troll or giant. When Aragorn translates the word Ettenmoors, he translates it into Trollfells. So we can see the troll coming here. We get an oblique reference. The second thing is that the Ettenmoors are actually very near to where Rivendell itself is located. Elrond, who is currently in disfavor and at risk of being cast somewhere himself, will in fact go out from Gil-galad's court and go to the Ettenmoors and live there. And what's more, he's going to do this soon. Rivendell is founded by Elrond during the war with Sauron over the Rings of Power. Now, I don't think that this means that they're going to actually turn Rivendell into Elrond's prison camp or something, but it's just a bit of an Easter egg. I think it's just kind of funny. Okay, one other fun Tolkien parallel that I loved from this episode. This was when Elrond is standing on top of the cliff, and Gil-galad and Galadriel have both turned against him and are trying to get the Rings of Power from him. And he's trapped and desperate, and he jumps off the cliff into the sea below. When he did this, I admit I kind of cheered. Why? Why is this significant? Because he's doing exactly what his mother did. So in the event that is called the Third Kinslaying, at the very end of the First Age, Elwing had the last Silmaril, and the sons of Feanor, who include Celebrimbor's father and uncles, came and attacked the camp and started killing the elves, trying to get them. And in the end, there is Elwing trapped on the edge of the cliff, holding the Silmaril, and the sons of Feanor closing in, trying to take it from her, and she throws herself off the cliff. And when she does, she becomes a seabird and flies away. This is why Elrond's clothes all have those seabird wings and feathers on the shoulders, to remember the moment when his mother jumped off the cliff and turned into a bird, escaping the grasp of their enemies. This, by the way, is a very unflattering parallel for Galadriel and Gil-galad. They are put by this parallel into the role of the Feanorians trying to take the Silmaril. It's a dark moment which suggests that Elrond is not wrong to try to resist them.
You sneaky evil buddy.
Elrond, no!
Well, that's episode 1. I feel like we have barely gotten started.
This week is rather mad. There are many additional elements that we are hoping to add, but our main focus is to get 3 full episodes of analysis to you in this first week.
But in future weeks, you can expect some new elements that you have never seen before on Rings and Realms. Things like interviews and discussions with special guests, including cast and crew from the Rings of Power,
as well as questions that you have given to us as our Kickstarter supporters. So we want to keep you involved in this process, and we'll answer as best we can. So thank you for joining us. Please consider pledging your support on Kickstarter for Rings and Realms.
And join us next time for episode 2.